Thank you, Wendy, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for staying till the end of the conference. I will speak about democracy because I think that this is part of our prompt. So what I'll present is part of my new book that will be released in November, and it's, part of an attempt to unlearn imperialism. I think that this is what we have to do. It's a lot of work for all our life. So let me start. When asking whether democracy will survive any of the dangers threatening it, one usually assumes that democracy is a desirable, if not the best, regime. This positive image of democracy cannot be sustained without relieving modern democracies of their responsibility for the catastrophic state of the world we live in. The threat to democratic regimes worldwide are, in part at least, the result of their own doings. This would be my point of departure. In what follows, I proceed in two parts. The first is a brief reconstruction of the imperial origins of our democracies and the imperial rights on which they are premised. The second is a call to disengage from the pursuit of progress and to assume our responsibility as experts in different fields to bring its destructive enterprise to a halt or to slow it down. Political philosophers often talk about the democratic regimes that appeared in the late 17th and 18th century, Netherlands, England, US, France, as a renewal of Greco-Roman forms, with Roman dresses and Roman phrases, as Marx writes. Despite recurring invocation of the ancient regimes in the political rhetoric of the time, this claim is historically and theoretically groundless. It ignores the crucial role of the new ways in which the body politics was reconstituted from the first days of the imperial expansion of Europe. When we talk about democracies, we should give greater attention to the imperial manufacturing of the body politic and grant it a constitutive place at the origins of modern democracy. The body politic is not one of the components of a political regime, but rather a site of violence through which democracies that I propose to qualify and to stop to relate to them as democracies. I propose to qualify them and relate to them as imperial democracies, rather than simply democracies, were constituted. This process has started in the 15th century as overseas invasions inaugurated this manufacture of a body politic that have not ceased since, and is conducted through genocides, forced migrations, enslavement, and land expropriation. And let me just very briefly dwell on this quotation from Hannah Arendt, and rather than, the blue marble or the black marble, let's bring us back to this moment when, the idea of the earth was invented and could be grasped, allegedly grasped, and be appropriated. And I would just like to call your attention to one thing in Hannah Arendt's description of Earth, the discovery of the Earth, the mapping of her lands, etc. And then she says that all, these technologies to appropriate the land, which were temptingly and forbiddingly open to all previous ages, then became into a globe, etc. So what I care about this quotation from Hannah Arendt is this kind of violation of what was forbidden in the appropriation of the land. When Hannah Arendt discusses the term world alienation, she associates it not only or simply with the discovery of new lands, but also with the discovery of the earth itself, mapping your lands and chartering your waters. When discussing this term, world alienation, she emphasizes the role which distance or distances play in transforming the human capacity to survey territories and subsequently destroyed the life worlds inhabiting them. And I'm quoting, "Any decrease of terrestrial distance can be won only at the price of putting a decisive distance between man and earth, of alienating man from his immediate earthly surroundings," unquote. In the case of others' territories, this tension between distance and proximity went through an additional reversal. The cities, cultures, objects, natural resources, ways of life, rituals, artisanal skills were so overwhelmingly rich, different, and unfamiliar that an undeniable distance awaited imperial actors rather than proximity. And I would like to show briefly this image. It's one of millions. This image, and to call your attention to the arrogance way of, those who collected them and brought this sculpture to Trevor Museum. The left hand holding the cup was almost intentionally broken almost everywhere to avoid explanations. So this is not the colonial direct deed. This is the way that people resisted against it. So when I'm speaking about this distance and proximity, I would like to keep both of these together, the colonial violence with the resistance. The closer they came to them, the more opaque, illegible, unruly, and singular their taxonomies, formations, and modes of being turned. Intrusion was often responded with variable degrees of objection, protection, and resistance. This distance that could not be abolished without further invasive violence was often transgressed and violated. These invasions jeopardized the lived reality of disparate and diverse societies whose body politic consisted, as it is implied by the term, the body politic, of all people living in a specific place. I propose to see the origin of digital democracies in this manipulation of the body politic, in the brutal manufacture of people as forced to embody or stand for and be recognized by imperial categories of all sorts. Further computational technologies that were invented in the mid-20th century, in addition to the old technologies that I've just described in relation to the body politic. So further computational technologies and devices had to be invented later in order to administer a world that had already been computationalized, organized through a growing variety of categories. These were imposed against people, against their will and interest, and with complete disregard to the common world that they created. Categories such as slaves, indentured laborers, refugees, citizens, patrollers, asylum seekers, overseers, collaborators, infiltrators, illegal migrants, undocumented or stateless. And I won't have time to dwell on it, but it's not by mistake that I included the citizen as part of these categories, because I think that we have to think about the invention of citizenship in continuity with them. So just very briefly to show you something about the production of refugees or infiltrators, here are some images from Palestine that was brutally destroyed by Israel in 1948, and here you see how people are becoming refugees and immediately after becoming infiltrators, hence eligible to be killed in the border. Here another image from the mass deportation of Palestinians, and here an image from the incessant attempt of Palestinians to return to Palestine. And I brought this image from 2011 just to say that the Great March of Return from 2018 is in continuity with these images. So let me briefly present 5 mechanisms of manufacturing the body politic. So I have already talked about the first one in a way, which is the transformation of the body politic into manipulable object exposed to both physical and symbolic operations through which people could be added and subtracted, displaced and relocated in separation from the objects among which they used to live and the cultural and spiritual infrastructures that sustain them. So now I would like to move to the second. So here it's, of course, an imaginary of the castes. And I will not have time to dwell on the images, unfortunately. And here I would like to move to the second category, which is the destruction of local taxonomies, environments and systems of meanings and rights, and their replacement with standardized taxonomies. So unlike, this kind of assumption that museums or other public venues will rescue us, I consider museums to be shrines of imperialism. And what we see here is how, images coming from different cultures, different taxonomies are becoming part of one taxonomy, which is the taxonomy of art. And here you see it in another image in an exhibition curated by Stiglitz of African art, with a kind of goodwill to juxtapose it to Picasso and Braque, as if to elevate these objects to this category of art. So I would like to move to the third category or third mechanism, which is the foreclosure of accountability for these violent and unjust modes of destruction. To avoid accountability, intervention in the erasure of the meaning of these procedures was required. So very briefly, I would like to show you this element, Hammurabi laws that are, were looted and are now in the Louvre. And of course, as these objects are becoming part of these institutions, these democratic institutions, imperial democratic institutions, their story can be narrated in a progressive way, that Hammurabi laws were awful, and Kamuvan, what we have to propose you is much better. Justice has made great progress ever since. And let me move to the fourth mechanism. Expropriation of non-white people of their wealth, resources, knowledge and skills, and mass physical and symbolic plunder of objects which were integral to their worlds, while extracting from these people the cheap or free labor which was required to sustain these mega projects that sought to create a new world. So here very briefly images from Congo before and after, and I will move to the fifth mechanism, which is mass and systemic attacks on women, in which rape and rescue are intertwined. Women's sense of being at home at their place is targeted, and they are deprived of their rights and authority within their communities. And here, very briefly, an example from the mass rape of German women as part of ending World War II and imposing a new world order. So here you have, one photographer in the middle, the interest in the photographer through the presence of another one, and the third one that is taking the photographs, but we don't have images of rape, from the mass rape of 2 million women, which is why these photographers are present, in order to somehow administer the imaginary of catastrophe that we will have, as, and to have democracy as what will rescue it. So so here is my attempt to create some, untaken photographs of rape and to insert them in books. Common histories and theories of rights facilitate the substitution of accountability for imperial and political crimes with a duty of a sort, defined as moral or otherwise, to extend rights to formerly colonized people. The rights in questions are implicated in and crafted according to imperial agendas that insist upon propagating them to other peoples, as in the famous case of the Napoleonic Wars following the French Revolution. And here again, not only we see the Napoleon in the entrance of a mosque that is violating with his scholarly expedition, but what you see are some, representations of the killing of 5,000 people that try to resist against this kind of bringing democracy to Egypt. These rights inherited from the French Revolution have a textual existence, and their origin is located in what became canonical documents of rights. Rejecting the transcendental status of this type of rights, I propose to present them for what they are, wordless or textual rights. They are one type of rights among many other types of rights that had to be erased in order to tie democracy with this notion of human rights that we inherited from the 18th century or from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Skipping the full typology of rights that I elaborated elaborate in my book, I will only dwell briefly on one additional type, which I call imperial rights. This is a type of right without which these wordless rights would not have been possible. And textual rights, these are the rights that are written here that we all know about them because they were imposed as canonical. They are cleansed of the world out of which they emerged and freed of the memory of and accountability for the violence that those who crafted them exercised against others. The systemic destruction of diverse worlds and the system of rights that rise up in the wake of their destruction enable these rights to gain a transcendental status, as if these rights, and only these rights, are befitting the name of rights. These rights are at the core of the discourse of human rights, and they render invisible other types of rights. But let me now dwell on what are imperial rights. Imperial rights, on the other hand, are unwritten rights. They are the rights that endowed the people who wrote these declarations with rights for others, endow them in this position to write rights for other people that they destroyed their system of rights. So they are unwritten and they are exercised over and against others, and yet they are performed through the proclamation of such universal documents that determine that hereafter textual rights are people's rights. These are the rights that authorize imperial actors to doom certain worlds for destruction and announce these textual rights as their proper replacement. Unwritten imperial rights are inscribed in the world by destroying others' worlds and replacing them with what is known as a modernized world that consists of benign institutions such as universities, museums, or archives that effectively streamline the imperial enterprise's general doctrine, as Said calls it. These rights are not inherited only through bloodlines or transfer of capital, but are rather acquired through a variety of professional positions: photographers, scholars, programmers, architects, etc., that play a role in the reproduction of the hierarchical structures created by imperialism on a global scale. The very existence and status of these rights is mostly denied, yet they organize people's being with others. And just briefly, this kind of imperial rights, right? The right to impose the French Empire worldwide with these kind of textual rights. We should ask how these imperial rights are ingrained in our professional gestures, procedures, and skills, and how we contribute to the ruling power's enterprise of smashing, ignoring, or forbidding other forms and formation of rights. Understanding this contribution of scholarship and expertise is crucial in envisaging a reversal of imperial rights from the right to the right not to. And just briefly, when I'm looking at this kind of maps that are made to show the movement of migrant, rather than looking at them as asylum seekers, this is kind of counter expeditions of people who are coming back to be in proximity of their objects looted and enshrined in different museums. So I relate to this as a kind of counter-imperial maps, and not as asylum seekers, because as I said at the beginning, the category of asylum seeker is an imperial category that we should problematize together with our categories of citizens. A major purpose of this reversal from the right to the right not to, the right to withdrawal from participating in the imperial project, envisage the emergence of a variety of calls for restitution, reparation, and decolonized spatial imagination, and understand the latter as the principle that should replace the incentive for and the pursuit of progress induced by market and empire. In order to do so, we must modulate our focus, turning it away from the way imperial violence is inscribed in the bodies of victims, mainly colonized groups and individuals, and toward the way it is exercised by citizens in less obvious sites such as museums, university archives, and digital laboratory. Imperial actors sought not only to exercise rights against others, but also to inscribe their rights in the world, meaning to impose a world. And just briefly, I would like to show you an image of Roma people in the 18th arrondissement in Paris that is being constantly destroyed by the police. And what you have is IKEA Amnesty kind of, proposed a progressive shelter to give a better world for refugees. This requires a constant campaign of destruction. Indigenous people have been alienated from their colonized worlds, worlds in which they once had a recognized place. Moreover, they were often denied membership or recognition as members in the body politic that gave rise to the imperial democratic regimes, which were formed by imperial actors for the benefit of limited groups of people. The constitution of modern democracies and of democratic discourse involves this double destruction of worlds to be replaced by new ones fabricated by imperial forces, and of system of rights and social fabrics to be replaced by treaties, bureaucratized governments, books of law, digital platforms, and digital humanities. The democratic discourse, the discourse about democracy, has not yet acknowledged its origin in its ongoing manufacture and reproduction of these absolute differences between members of the body politic. These differences between those recognized by the sovereign imperial power as members of the body politic and all the others who have been forced to embody non-citizens categories became the core of democratic literacy. With the same gesture, citizens, with quotation mark, the heirs of imperial textual rights were created alongside these other imperial entities who are perceived as extra, superfluous to the democracy's core, people against whom citizens are authorized to act and to do with them whatever we wished, to quote Amerigo Vespucci reports in his first letter from 1499 about the actions he and others conducted during his expedition. Whereas in a pre-manufactured body politic, rights emerge from the community as part of caring for a shared world, imperial rights are predicated on a differential body politic and instrumental in the regularization of rights over others, a regularization that naturalized the systemic destruction of diverse extant political systems. The right to destroy, and this is an imperial right par excellence, never became the object of democratic deliberations, and it continues to be pursued relentlessly to the point that in every place where people were viciously dispossessed, the democratic regime could be offered as the only possible future for the recovery of people from their devastated worlds. So I propose to think about the right to destroy as the major democratic right that as citizens we inherited. Progress is the imperial mode of storming the world. The imperial movement of progress is pursued, on the one hand, as if along a single straight line of advance, while on the other, it operates in a suicidal cycle where the new can hardly survive the constant and renewable threat of being declared unfit by the newest. The new is an imperial imperative, a requirement, and a command, but it is framed as an inspiration and a promise in ways that separate it from the violence it involves. Pursued for the sake of itself, it is above all a movement, destructive and unstoppable. The new, with quotation mark, unfolds in a particular temporality, that of historical progress, without which nothing can be announced as new. Contrary to the common narratives and theories about photography, photography did not initiate a new world, nor should it be studied as having its own, history. Okay. And I propose to think about digital media in a similar way, rather than being taken by the invention of devices to understand the technologies of manipulating the body politic that started in the 15th century as the point of departure for further technologies. The photographic device was invented, instituted, and flourished in a world that owed its existence to massive destruction and plunder of others. In that world, the technology of the shutter was already, the technology of the shutter that is associated with photography, we have to acknowledge that it was already in place, dissecting communities, people, and objects into standardized pieces of data, the ultimate object of different computation strategies. With photography, the operation of the technology of the shutter that separates, dissects, and sanctions the effects and the outcome of its violence was materialized in a recognizable device. Shutters provide official approvals that there is no violence, even though people suffer from its exercise and experience violence as violence. Shutters are an integral part of a big cultural shrines, universal procedures, a multitude of technologies, legal corpuses written in universal language, and a culture of documents that attest and certify that they are free of violence. Thus, with the operation of shutters, sacred graves are made into archaeological sites, power masks are made into works of art, and facial traits are made into types. This is how we have to understand different formation of resistance, often followed by massacres, as we see on a daily basis coming from Palestine, from the resistance of the thousands of Egyptians who tried to prevent the Napoleonic expedition from dissecting their commons and extracting its fragments in the form of objects or representations to be transferred to European museums, through the Palestinian Great March of Return, where protesters insist on their right to return, which is actually, and let's face it, is their right to be in Palestine where they are, and renew the meaning of Palestine outside of the logic of empire, of which Israel is just another proper name, and outside of the logic of capitalist markets. The new statuses, new names, new devices, new technologies, new world of things and people could not have come to exist without the imposition of imperial rights against others and others' worlds, so as their objection would be made even more difficult to pursue, given that these imperial rights against others were legalized and documented. Let me clarify again. By New World, I understand mainly a configuration of violence that destroys existing worlds of science, activities, hierarchies, and social fabrics, and replaces them with a new universal type of objects, classification, laws, technologies, and meanings. In this so-called New World, local people and resources are assigned specific roles, places, and functions. In images and image-making practices, it concretizes, reified the right, In images and image-making practices, it concretized and reified the right to destroy, to accumulate, to appropriate, to differentiate, to study, to rescue, to record, to document, to salvage, and to exhibit. Photography could not have been institutionalized as a practice of photographers without these rights that colonizers acquired to themselves, and photography also contributes to naturalization and constituting of such rights over others as given. So let me end with this image of photographer strikes in response to the daily massacre conducted by the state that included targeting photographers, Palestinian photographers and photojournalists. Rather than asking if democracy could survive, I would ask how to put our power, our expertise, our skills and privileges embedded in our professional positions on strike. Imagine going on strike. Thank you.